My name is Luna Rivers. I'm 34 years old, and for most of my adult life, I've worked in operations, projects, timelines, handovers, the invisible connective tissue that keeps organizations from quietly falling apart. I live in Vancouver. I've never been the loudest person in the room. I've never tried to be. People usually describe me the same way, if they describe me at all. Reliable, calm, someone who has it handled. The kind of person you loop in when something is already late, already messy, already about to break. I was trusted with responsibility, but rarely with influence. Included for execution, excluded from decisions. Seen as capable, but somehow not central. If you asked my coworkers back then, they would probably say I was easy to work with. Low maintenance, no drama, I didn't demand credit, I didn't challenge people publicly, I didn't make things uncomfortable. And because of that, I slowly became part of the background. Useful, present, but not really seen. This story isn't about a villain. There's no single person to blame. There's no shouting match, no dramatic resignation speech, no moment where everyone suddenly realizes they were wrong. That's important for me to say up front. What happened to me happened quietly, the way most real things do. This is the story of how I became the most reliable employee in the room, and also the most ignored. And it's the story of what changed when I stopped rescuing things. For a long time, I believed that if I just kept doing good work, things would naturally balance out. That consistency would be noticed, that competence would translate into respect, that being indispensable would eventually mean being heard. So when something slipped, I fixed it. When someone dropped a detail, I caught it. When a process broke, I stayed late and patched it together, without announcing it, without documenting it loudly, without asking for acknowledgement. I told myself I was being professional, mature, team-oriented. What I didn't realize was that I was teaching people exactly how much of myself they could take without consequence. This isn't a revenge story. I didn't set out to punish anyone. I didn't wake up one day angry or bitter. What happened was subtler than that. It began with awareness, by noticing patterns, understanding the quiet economics of attention, effort, and power inside systems that reward visibility more than value. Over time, I made choices, small at first, then irreversible. I didn't confront, I didn't accuse, I didn't explain myself more loudly. I simply stopped absorbing the cost of other people's neglect. What followed wasn't explosive. It was structural. And by the time anyone noticed, it was already too late to undo. I'm telling this story now, not to dramatize my past and not to position myself as a hero, but because I know how many people are living in that same quiet space, being counted on but not counted in, holding things together while slowly disappearing inside the role. So as you listen, I want you to ask yourself, gently, honestly, have you ever realized something only mattered once you stopped saving it? To understand who I became, you have to understand who I was to them. Inside the company, my name carried a very specific meaning. Not a title, more like a function. When someone said, "Loop Luna in," it usually meant something was already behind schedule. When they said, "Luna will know," it meant no one else had bothered to keep track. When they said, "She's solid," it was never followed by, "Let's ask her opinion." I wasn't overlooked because I was bad at my job. I was overlooked because I was too good at absorbing complexity quietly. I sat in meetings where decisions were announced, not discussed. Slides would move quickly, timelines would be optimistic, and risks would be minimized. And I would notice the gaps immediately. The dependency no one accounted for, the handover that didn't exist yet, the assumption that would later become a problem. Sometimes I'd raise a hand gently. Sometimes I'd make a note and handle it later myself. Over time, I learned which was faster. I wasn't invisible in the dramatic sense. People knew me. They greeted me warmly. They trusted me, but they trusted me the way you trust infrastructure, only noticing it when it fails, assuming it will always hold. No one asked how much weight I was carrying. My performance reviews were consistent, dependable, strong executor, keeps things moving. There was always praise, but it was sealed off from momentum, compliments without consequence, appreciation without expansion. I wasn't being pushed out. I was being held in place, and I participated in that more than I like to admit. I told myself stories that made it easier, that not everyone needed visibility, that influence could exist quietly, that leadership would notice patterns eventually, that my work spoke for itself. I believed that calm competence was enough, that it had a natural gravity. What I didn't see yet was that gravity only works when something is allowed to orbit you. I was orbiting everyone else. There were moments, small ones, where the imbalance surfaced. A meeting recap where my contributions were summarized under team to support. A project launch where someone else presented outcomes built on systems I had stabilized. A casual comment like, "You're so reliable, I never worry about your side." Delivered as a compliment, but landed like a closed door. Still, I didn't feel angry. That's important. I felt responsible. Responsible for continuity. Responsible for smoothing edges. Responsible for keeping the emotional and operational temperature low. I was good at that. People relied on it. In group settings, I spoke last, if at all. Not because I was shy, but because I was tracking everything. Who needed what? What wasn't being said? What would fall apart if someone didn't step in later? Silence for me wasn't absence. It was surveillance. But surveillance without authority has a cost. Slowly, without any single dramatic moment, my role crystallized. I was the one you could depend on to fix it, not the one you consulted to shape it. I was the safety net, not the architect. The person who made everyone else look prepared. And when you play that role long enough, people stop imagining you anywhere else. I noticed how newer employees were encouraged to speak boldly, even when they were wrong, how confidence traveled faster than accuracy, how visibility created its own evidence. I watched as people with half the context influenced decisions simply because they claimed space early. I didn't resent them. I studied them. From the outside, my career looked stable, linear, respectable. But internally, something was eroding, not my confidence in my ability, but my belief that effort and recognition were naturally linked. The truth is, I was everywhere, and nowhere that mattered. I wasn't underestimated intellectually. I was underestimated structurally. My value was categorized, contained, and quietly exploited by a system that rewards those who protect their time more than those who protect outcomes. And because I never let things break, no one ever learned what it actually cost to keep them whole. That was who I was to them, not invisible, just replaceable in theory, indispensable in practice, and safely ignored because I made it easy. At the time, I still believed that being essential was enough. I didn't yet understand what happens when you stop providing that for free. The first small cut didn't look like an insult. That's why it stayed with me. It happened during a project transition meeting, one of those routine handovers where nothing dramatic is supposed to happen, the kind where people half listen, already thinking about their next call. I had spent weeks stabilizing the project behind the scenes, fixing gaps in documentation, rebuilding timelines that had quietly drifted, making sure dependencies actually lined up with reality. I came in prepared as usual, notes organized, risks mapped, questions ready. Not to challenge, just to clarify. About 20 minutes in, the project lead summarized the next steps and said casually, "Operations will handle the rest." Operations, not me, not my role, just a bucket. I waited. This was usually the moment someone would ask for confirmation or detail. Instead, the meeting moved on. So I spoke up, not forcefully, not defensively, just precise. "There are a couple of dependencies that haven't been assigned yet," I said. "If we don't lock those down this week, the timeline will slip." The room went quiet for a second. Then the project lead smiled and said, "Right, we'll figure that out." And then, this part matters. He turned to someone else and asked them what they thought. It was subtle, almost elegant. No one interrupted me. No one dismissed me outright. My words weren't rejected. They were absorbed and rerouted, detached from their source. The meeting ended. People logged off. Calendars moved on. No one mentioned it again, except me. Later that afternoon, I checked the project board. The dependencies I'd flagged were still unassigned. So I did what I always did. I filled in the gaps, reached out, clarified ownership, adjusted timelines. The project stayed on track. From the outside, nothing went wrong, but something shifted internally. Not anger, not even disappointment. It was more like a data point, a small but undeniable signal that something about how I was perceived didn't match how much I was contributing. I replayed the moment, not emotionally but analytically. The tone, the eye contact, the way my input had been acknowledged without being anchored to me. It wasn't personal. It was positional. Others didn't notice because there was nothing obvious to notice. No raised voices, no awkward silence, no visible tension, just a smooth continuation of business as usual. That's how these things work. Disrespect rarely announces itself. It usually arrives disguised as efficiency. Over the next few weeks, I saw the same pattern repeat in smaller ways. An email where my detailed breakdown was forwarded upward without my name attached. A meeting note that referenced operational concerns I had articulated verbatim. A decision justified using risks I had outlined without anyone looping me into the final call. Each moment was minor, forgettable, easy to rationalize. So I did. I told myself people were busy, that attribution wasn't always intentional, that the work mattered more than credit, that I didn't need to be territorial about ideas. But I remembered, not with resentment, with clarity. I began to notice how quickly ownership shifted once ideas left my mouth, how easily my presence could be removed without friction, how the system benefited from my awareness while keeping me peripheral to authority. I haven't changed my behavior yet. That's important. I didn't pull back. I didn't test boundaries. I didn't confront anyone. I just started noting things. What was asked of me versus what was offered. What was assumed I'd handle versus what I was consulted on. Where my name appeared and where it didn't. That first small cut didn't hurt. It informed. It told me that reliability without boundaries becomes a resource others feel entitled to manage. That calm delivery makes it easier for your contributions to be redistributed. Being reasonable can make it easy for you to rearrange. No one else clocked that meeting as significant. If I brought it up later, it would have sounded petty, overinterpreted, emotional. So I kept it to myself, and quietly, something changed in how I listened. I stopped hearing praise as validation. I stopped hearing, "We'll figure it out," as reassurance. I stopped assuming my presence was synonymous with influence. The system had shown me something true, without meaning to. And once you see that kind of truth, you don't unsee it. You just decide what to do with it. After that first small cut, nothing changed on the surface. Projects moved forward. Deadlines were met. Meetings stayed polite. People still thanked me. Still said my name with relief when something went wrong. Still trusted me to handle it. That's how disrespect becomes normalized, by never crossing the line loudly enough to justify resistance. What did change was frequency. The moments I had once treated as exceptions began to form a pattern. My input was acknowledged but rarely credited. My concerns were noted, but addressed only after they caused friction somewhere else. My availability was assumed, my boundaries were undefined, and because I never let the consequences fully land, no one ever connected the dots. I would flag a risk in a meeting. It would be deferred. Weeks later, when that exact issue surfaced, someone else would step in to solve it using the framework I had already outlined, often with me quietly filling in the missing pieces behind the scenes. I told myself I was being a team player. I told myself this was what maturity looked like. The thing about normalization is that it doesn't require malice. It only requires repetition without consequence. And I helped make it easy. When my name was left off an email thread that directly affected my workload, I didn't correct it. I simply responded with the information needed, making sure things stayed on track. When decisions were made that contradicted operational reality, I worked around them instead of challenging them directly. Every time I did that, I thought I was protecting the project. What I was really protecting was everyone else's comfort. I became very good at translating vague directives into functional plans, at smoothing over misalignment before it became visible, at absorbing urgency that wasn't mine, and slowly, quietly, my silence was interpreted as consent. There's a particular moment I remember, not because it was dramatic, but because it was ordinary. A senior manager once said, in passing, "Luna will adjust if needed." Don't ask Luna, not confirmed with Luna, just adjust. No one looked at me when he said it. No one waited for a response. It was treated as a given, like gravity. I nodded, took notes, adjusted. At the time, I didn't feel wronged. I felt expected, useful, predictable. And that's where rationalization does its work. I told myself that pushing back would create friction, that it wasn't worth being difficult over small things. My job was to make the system work, not to disrupt it. I also told myself something more dangerous, that because I could handle it, I should. That belief kept me quiet longer than any external pressure ever could. Around me, others were learning different lessons. They learned how to say no publicly, how to redirect responsibility upward, how to speak confidently even when their understanding was partial. They weren't punished for it. In fact, they were often rewarded with visibility, with influence, with perceived leadership. I noticed this. I didn't resent it. I just assumed my path was different. What I didn't realize yet was that by normalizing small dismissals, I was training the system to see me as elastic, someone whose time and attention could be stretched without breaking. But elasticity has a limit. Internally, something began to dull. Not my work ethic, but my expectation of reciprocity. I stopped anticipating recognition, stopped assuming alignment. I became more procedural, less hopeful. Still, I didn't speak up, because speaking up would have required explaining a pattern no one else had noticed or needed to notice. It would have required me to articulate value in a language the system didn't ask me to use. So I stayed quiet, and the system stayed comfortable. From the outside, nothing looked wrong. From the inside, I was slowly adjusting my understanding of how power actually moved, who was allowed to take space, and who was expected to absorb impact. This wasn't cruelty, it was designed, and I was beginning to see my place in it, not as a victim, but as a participant who had mistaken endurance for leverage. The disrespect wasn't escalating, it was stabilizing, becoming the baseline. And once something becomes normal, the cost of resisting it feels higher than the cost of carrying it. That's where I was, right before I realized that silence, too, is a behavior the system learns from. By the time I understood the role I'd been assigned, I had already been performing it for years. No one ever sat me down and said, "This is who you are here." The role emerged quietly through repetition and reinforcement. I was the stabilizer, the person you bring in when something is shaky, not to redesign it, but to make it hold. I wasn't invited to early conversations where direction was set. I was invited after momentum already existed, when optimism needed structure and assumptions needed translating into reality. That distinction mattered more than I realized at first. In planning meetings, others spoke about vision. I spoke about constraints. They talked about where things were going. I talked about what would break on the way. My input was always practical, grounded, necessary, and therefore easy to frame as support, not leadership. Over time, expectations crystallized. I was expected to be calm, expected to be available, expected to catch things before they became visible problems. What I wasn't expected to do was redefine anything. I noticed how conversations shifted when I entered the room. Not negatively, just subtly. Less speculative, more procedural. People would turn to me not to ask what we do, but can this work? And once I answered, the conversation moved on without me. I had become a validator, not a contributor. And again, I participated in this more than I want to admit. I used my competence to earn trust, but I never used that trust to claim space. I thought those things were sequential, that if I waited long enough, one would naturally lead to the other. Instead, they became compartmentalized. There was a moment when this became unmistakably clear. A new initiative was being discussed, one that intersected directly with systems I had designed and maintained. I wasn't invited to the initial strategy meeting. I found out about it afterward when I was asked to operationalize the outcome. I asked, politely, why operations hadn't been included earlier. The response was gentle, almost kind. We didn't want to slow things down. That sentence did more than any insult could have. It told me exactly how I was seen, not as someone who added clarity, but as someone who added friction. Not because I was negative, but because I was accurate. And accuracy, in the early stages of decision-making, is often treated as an inconvenience. So my role was to arrive later, when ideas were already in motion, when changing direction would cost too much, when my job was no longer to influence, but to adapt. I was useful there, extremely useful, and that usefulness became my ceiling. People didn't see me as invisible. They saw me as settled, defined, contained, someone who was excellent where she was, and therefore unlikely to need anything else. That's the quiet trap of competence. If you perform a role too well without renegotiating its boundaries, the system stops imagining you beyond it. I wasn't passed over in obvious ways. I was simply never considered. My name didn't come up when influence was being distributed. My absence from those conversations wasn't an oversight. It was consistent. I could feel the shape of the box around me, even if no one else acknowledged it. And still, I didn't push, because pushing would have meant challenging a story that everyone, including me, had agreed to. That I was the one who handled things, the one who adjusted, the one who didn't need recognition to function. I told myself I was above that my value wasn't tied to titles or visibility. What I didn't realize yet was that access is valuable. And without access, even the most competent person is just maintaining someone else's decisions. I wasn't angry. I was alert. For the first time, I stopped asking, how can I do this better? And started asking, why is this always mine to carry? That question didn't change my behavior immediately, but it changed how I interpreted everything that followed. Because once you see the role you've been assigned, you also see the quiet expectation that comes with it, that you'll keep playing it, no matter what it costs you. The day something shifted didn't come with a confrontation. There was no argument, no raised voice, no dramatic realization delivered in a sentence sharp enough to quote later. It was an ordinary day. That's what makes it difficult to explain and impossible to forget. I was sitting at my desk early, before most people logged on. The office was quiet in that particular way. It only is before the day begins. Screens glowing, coffee cooling, systems waiting to be used. I was reviewing a project timeline that had been revised 3 times already, none of those revisions initiated by the people who had designed it. Each change traced back to the same thing, reality. Dependencies they hadn't considered, the capacity they'd assumed existed. Handoffs that required coordination no one had planned for. All of it had passed through me. I noticed as I scrolled that my name appeared nowhere in the official documentation, not in ownership, not in acknowledgements, not in the decision log. Yet every single adjustment reflected choices I had made. And something in me paused, not emotionally, logically. I asked myself a question I had never allowed myself to ask before. What would actually happen if I didn't fix this? The answer surprised me. Things wouldn't collapse, not immediately. They would wobble, confusion would surface, questions would rise, questions that had been quietly bypassing me for years, because I absorbed them before they became visible. For the first time, I saw the difference between being essential and being protected. I had been essential, but nothing about my role was protected. My time, my clarity, my position, the system relied on me, but it didn't account for me. That distinction landed with unexpected weight. Later that day, in a routine check-in, someone asked if I could just quickly adjust a deliverable that had changed scope overnight. No apology, no acknowledgement of the change. Just an assumption that I would realign everything downstream. I heard myself say calmly, "I'll take a look." And then I didn't immediately fix it. I sat with the request. Let it exist without absorbing it. Let the discomfort of delay surface. Mine, not theirs. That was new. In the past, my reflex had been automatic. Step in, smooth it out, make it disappear. This time, I noticed the impulse and chose not to act on it right away. Nothing bad happened. An hour passed. Then 2. Someone followed up, not impatiently, just checking. I replied with a question instead of an answer. A small one, clarifying scope, confirming ownership. The conversation slowed, and in that slowdown, something else became visible. How much momentum depended on my immediate compliance. This wasn't a rebellion, it was an observation. I realized that I had been trading speed for invisibility. By moving too quickly, I removed the need for anyone to recognize the complexity I managed. My efficiency had been erasing evidence. That day, I didn't make a declaration. I didn't announce boundaries. I didn't confront anyone about the past. I simply noticed that silence could be chosen. And that choice didn't have to be explained. By the end of the day, the adjustment was made, but not invisibly. It required confirmation from 2 other people, a timeline discussion, a brief acknowledgement of constraints that had previously been ignored. Nothing dramatic, but different. I closed my laptop and felt something unfamiliar. Not triumph, not relief, but alignment. For the first time, my internal sense of fairness matched my external behavior. I wasn't withholding effort. I wasn't sabotaging anything. I was allowing the system to experience a fraction of the friction I had been quietly eliminating for years. That was the shift, not from kindness to cruelty, but from unconscious self-erasure to intentional presence. I didn't know yet where this would lead. I hadn't formed a plan. I only knew that I could no longer pretend that my role was neutral. Every system teaches you how to participate in it. That day, I learned I could teach it something back, without raising my voice, without burning bridges, without becoming someone I didn't recognize. I walked away from my desk knowing one thing for certain. I wasn't going to rescue things by default anymore. And once that decision was made, quietly, internally, nothing was ever quite the same again. After that day, I didn't announce a new way of working. I didn't reset expectations in a meeting or send a carefully worded message about boundaries. On the surface, nothing about me appeared to change. I still showed up, still delivered, still responded calmly. The difference was internal and deliberate. Silence, for the first time, became a choice. I stopped filling gaps automatically. When a request arrived without context, I asked for it. When a decision landed in my lap without ownership defined, I waited. Not passively, intentionally. I allowed questions to surface that I had previously intercepted before anyone else could notice them. At first, people didn't register the shift. They interpreted my slower response as bandwidth, as the focus elsewhere, as a temporary blip. No one challenged it because I had built years of credibility. Reliability buys you a lot of interpretive grace. But beneath that grace, something else began to happen. Meetings stretched, threads multiplied, clarifications were requested in spaces where I used to resolve them quietly. People began asking each other the questions they used to ask me privately. And because I wasn't stepping in immediately, those questions lingered longer than anyone was used to. Some mistook that for hesitation. I noticed it in the language. Luna hasn't weighed in yet. We're waiting on ops. She'll probably adjust. Probably. That word told me everything. My silence wasn't being read as intention. It was being read as delay, as something that would resolve itself once I eventually stepped in. So I stayed quiet a little longer, not out of spite, out of precision. I wanted to see where the pressure actually accumulated when I wasn't absorbing it. Who felt it first? Who had the authority to resolve it, and who didn't? This wasn't about playing games. It was about understanding the real architecture of responsibility. I still answered direct questions, still supported outcomes I believed in, but I stopped anticipating needs that hadn't been articulated. I stopped translating ambiguity into action without confirmation. The system didn't break. It revealed itself. I saw how often urgency was manufactured by poor planning, how quickly can you just turned into structural dependency, how easily my calm presence had masked collective inefficiency. Some colleagues grew uneasy, not with me, but with the silence itself. In a culture accustomed to immediate smoothing, unresolved edges felt uncomfortable. I heard comments framed as concern. "You've been quiet lately. Everything okay?" I smiled, said yes, and meant it, because for the first time in a long time, everything was okay with me. Internally, I felt steady, grounded, less reactive. I wasn't rushing to prove my value anymore. I was letting it exist without constant demonstration. Externally, though, my silence began to be misinterpreted. A few people assumed I was disengaging. Maybe I was tired, or distracted, or quietly unhappy. They didn't imagine strategy because they had never needed to imagine that from me before. That, too, was data. It told me that my previous overfunctioning had trained people to underestimate my agency. They saw my absence of noise as an absence of power. I didn't correct that assumption. I also didn't overcorrect in the other direction. I wasn't withholding expertise. I was placing it, choosing when to speak, where to respond, what to let surface without my intervention. The more I did this, the clearer something became. Silence is only weakness when it's involuntary. When it's chosen, it becomes leverage. Not because it manipulates, but because it restores balance. It allows systems to experience the true cost of their own design. And slowly, subtly, the dynamic began to shift. People started looping me in earlier. Not out of respect yet, but out of caution. They began checking assumptions before finalizing them. They asked questions that used to be rhetorical. No one named the change, but everyone felt it. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't demanded recognition. I hadn't withdrawn effort. I had simply stopped rescuing things before they were allowed to be seen. And in doing so, I was no longer invisible. I was unpredictable in a system that relied on my predictability. That made people pay attention. While people were adjusting to my new quiet, they didn't notice what I was doing with the space it created. That was the advantage of having been invisible for so long. No one monitored my movements. No one questioned my process. I had room, mental room, temporal room, to observe without interference. I wasn't plotting an exit. I wasn't planning a confrontation. I was mapping. For years, I had carried the organization's memory in my head. Not formally, not in a way that appeared on org charts or documentation. Just patterns, dependencies. The informal handshakes between teams made things work. The unspoken rules about who really decided what and who simply announced it. Now I began turning that memory into something external. Quietly, methodically, I started documenting workflows the way they actually operated, not the way they were presented in slides. I noted where approvals were symbolic and where they were real, where decisions stalled, where they bypassed the process entirely. I didn't do this out of spite. I did it out of clarity. I wanted to understand the system without myself in it. What breaks when I don't intervene? What slows when I don't translate? What requires authority and what only requires attention? I learned more in those weeks than I had in years of participation. I noticed that many people who appeared decisive were simply the first to speak. That momentum often replaced analysis. That risk was acceptable as long as someone else absorbed it later. And that someone had often been me. I also began tracking my own contributions, something I had never bothered with before. Not for performance reviews, for pattern recognition. Which projects relied on my institutional knowledge? Which teams came to me only when things were already fragile? Which decisions referenced operational reality only after it became unavoidable? The picture that emerged was both sobering and empowering. I wasn't just a support function. I was a stabilizing layer the organization hadn't formally acknowledged, because formal acknowledgement would require formal accountability. They benefited from my discretion, from my unwillingness to escalate, from my instinct to protect outcomes at my own expense, and I had benefited from believing that restraint was the same as virtue. That belief was dissolving. I began asking different questions in meetings, no more questions, cleaner ones, questions that revealed gaps without filling them, that exposed assumptions without correcting them. Sometimes I said nothing at all and let silence do the work. I also paid attention to what happened when I wasn't in the room. Projects I had once shepherded moved forward with more friction. Not failure, just visible strain. People reached out to each other more, escalated sooner, disagreed openly. It wasn't chaos, it was transparency. No one traced this shift back to me. They couldn't. There was no single action to point to, just an accumulation of small absences. Meanwhile, I was positioning myself not upward, but outward. I strengthened relationships across teams without making them transactional. I learned who valued precision over speed, who listened when things got uncomfortable, who had authority but lacked context, and who had context but no authority. I didn't advertise my knowledge. I placed it where it mattered. I updated documentation, not as a hero, but as a record. I clarified processes not by enforcing them, but by making their absence visible. I made sure that when things worked, the work could be seen. All of this happened under the radar, because no one expects preparation from the person they assume will always adapt. What they never noticed was that I was no longer building safety nets for them. I was building options for myself. Options to stay if the system is adjusted, options to step aside if it didn't, options to speak if speaking becomes necessary. For the first time, my effort was aligned with my agency. I wasn't waiting to be recognized. I was becoming unignorable. Not through noise, but through structure. And the most important thing I learned during that time was this. When you stop rescuing systems, you start seeing which ones are actually worth saving. The reveal wasn't something anyone announced to me. There was no email, no meeting, no sudden shift in tone where I realized, now they see it. The reveal happened quietly, over time as patterns aligned. It began when I noticed how often decisions stalled in my absence. Not catastrophically, just enough to create uncertainty. Conversations looped, questions repeated. People hesitated where they hadn't before. At first, I assumed it was a coincidence. A busy quarter, competing priorities. Then it kept happening. The same types of issues surfaced again and again. Handoffs, scope boundaries, sequencing. The very areas I had managed so smoothly that no one had thought to formalize them. And then I saw it clearly. I wasn't just supporting the system, I was cohering it. That was the leverage. Not authority, not visibility, coherence. I was the person who understood how decisions actually traveled, how they translated into action, where they broke down, where they needed interpretation. Without that translation, everything still moved, but less cleanly, less confidently. The organization hadn't built redundancy for that. They had built comfort. This realization didn't come with satisfaction. It came with sobriety. Because leverage, once recognized, brings responsibility. I had a choice. Continue supplying coherence without acknowledgement, or allow the system to feel the absence long enough to adapt, or to fail in visible ways. I didn't want failure. I wanted accuracy. So I tested the edges. When asked to step in informally, I asked for context publicly. When decisions were made without operational input, I let timelines reflect that reality. When risks were minimized verbally, I documented them neutrally. I wasn't withholding information, I was anchoring it, and the effects became harder to ignore. Leaders started asking questions they hadn't asked before. Not about outcomes, but about process, about why things took longer, about where the alignment was breaking. Still, no one said my name. That's the strange thing about structural leverage. It's often felt before it's attributed. Privately, I saw the full picture. I had access to cross-functional knowledge that no single manager possessed. I understood which shortcuts were survivable and which weren't. I knew where the system bent and where it snapped. And I had been offering that knowledge freely, without terms. The reveal was understanding that terms matter, not in a transactional sense, but in a relational one. If I continued operating as an unbounded resource, nothing would change. If I withdrew entirely, I would become replaceable in theory, and the system would absorb the cost eventually. The real leverage was neither compliance nor exit. It was a definition. Defining what I owned, what I advised on, what required my involvement, and what didn't. That definition didn't need to be announced yet. It needed to be true. So I began living it. I stopped answering questions that belonged to other people's roles. I redirected ownership without judgment. I clarified when I was advising versus executing. This created friction, but the right kind. The kind that reveals mismatched expectations. And then, one afternoon, I saw the clearest signal yet. A decision was paused, not because of disagreement, but because someone said, "We should check this with Luna first." Not because I demanded it, not because it was policy, but because proceeding without my input felt risky. That was the moment. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt calm. Because leverage, when recognized internally first, doesn't need to be weaponized. It needs to be placed. I knew then that I had options that didn't involve confrontation or sacrifice, that I could reshape my role without spectacle, that the system was already adjusting, it just didn't know why yet. The private reveal wasn't about power over others. It was about power over myself. Understanding that I no longer had to overextend to be valuable, that my clarity was an asset, not a liability. That silence, when paired with structure, creates gravity. From that moment on, every decision I made was informed by one simple truth. I was no longer invisible. I was simply choosing when and how to be seen. Once you recognize leverage, you can't pretend you don't see it anymore. That was the tension I lived with after the private reveal. Not urgency, but clarity. I understood the system well enough now to know what my options were, and more importantly, what each option would cost. I could continue as I was, quietly reshaping expectations through behavior alone. Let the system adapt slowly. Let people learn over time that my involvement wasn't automatic. This path was safe. Minimal disruption, but it depended on patience and on others choosing to reflect. I could confront it directly, request a formal redefinition of my role, present evidence, ask for recognition, authority, or scope. That path was visible, rational, risky in a different way. Because once you name a problem inside a system that benefits from ambiguity, you invite defensiveness. Or I could choose something else entirely, something irreversible, Not dramatic, not hostile, just final. The decision didn't happen all at once. It crystallized over several small moments where I saw how easily progress reverted when pressure eased, how quickly people defaulted back to old assumptions the moment things stabilized. The system adjusted, but only as much as it had to. And I realized something important. If my presence was required to keep awareness alive, then the change wasn't real. That's when I understood that my role wasn't just to protect outcomes. It was to protect my future. The irreversible choice wasn't about leaving immediately. It was about removing the option to go back to being undefined. I decided to formalize what had previously been informal. Quietly, I began preparing a proposal. Not for a promotion, not for a title, but for scope. Clear ownership, decision rights, boundaries. A definition that aligned with the reality of my contributions. I didn't frame it as dissatisfaction. I framed it as accuracy. At the same time, I prepared for the possibility that the answer would be no. That preparation mattered. I updated my documentation, cleaned up my records, made sure that what I knew existed outside my head. Not to give it away, but to make the transition possible if needed. Because the most powerful position is one where staying is a choice, not a necessity. The irreversible part wasn't the proposal itself. It was the internal shift. I accepted that if the system couldn't accommodate clarity, I would not contort myself to fit it anymore. That I wouldn't slowly shrink back into the role of silent stabilizer just because it was familiar. That decision closed a door behind me. Once you choose not to be invisible again, you can't unknow that choice. I wasn't angry, I wasn't impatient, I was resolved. When the conversation eventually happened, it was calm, grounded, data-driven. I didn't list grievances. I described patterns. I explained risk. I outlined what was sustainable and what wasn't. There was no argument. There was hesitation. Because clarity forces systems to reveal what they actually value. And not all systems are ready for that. I left that conversation knowing the outcome wasn't fully in my control anymore. But my integrity was. The irreversible decision wasn't about forcing change. It was about refusing to disappear. And once that choice is made, once you step into alignment with yourself, everything that follows, good or bad, becomes simpler. Not easier, but simpler. After the decision point, I didn't wait for permission. That's something people often misunderstand about quiet change. They assume it begins with approval. In reality, it begins with alignment, by making sure your actions no longer contradict what you know to be true. Outwardly, I remained exactly the same. Same tone, same professionalism, same delivery. If anyone was watching closely, they would have seen consistency. What they didn't see was structure forming beneath the surface. I began treating my time the way organizations treat capital. Deliberately, transparently, and with clear allocation. I documented my hours, not to justify them, but to understand where they were going. Which work was core, which was compensatory, which existed solely because ambiguity had been allowed to persist. The patterns were unmistakable. A significant portion of my effort wasn't tied to my role at all. It was tied to other people's emissions, so I stopped covering those gaps silently. When asked to take on work that didn't belong to my scope, I clarified ownership. When timelines were compressed without consultation, I documented the trade-offs. When risk was accepted implicitly, I made it explicit. None of this required confrontation. It required consistency. At the same time, I took care of things people rarely associate with a professional agency: legal clarity, financial optionality, structural independence. I reviewed my contracts, understood my notice periods, clarified intellectual contribution boundaries, made sure nothing I had built was dependent on me remaining undefined. I also strengthened my external footing, updated my portfolio, not with accomplishments, but with systems I had stabilized, processes I had designed, outcomes I had protected under pressure. I didn't broadcast this. I didn't hint at it. I was moving in silence. Inside the organization, people were still adjusting to the new normal. Requests came more slowly. Decisions were more cautious. Some things took longer, not because I was obstructing, but because they now had to be considered. The system was paying a small but noticeable tax on its previous assumptions. No one traced this back to me, because I was still delivering, just no longer subsidizing. That distinction is invisible to people who have benefited from the subsidy. I noticed something else during this time: how calm I felt. Not triumphant, not vindicated, just steady. For the first time, my professional life wasn't running on adrenaline or anticipation. I wasn't bracing for last-minute rescues. I wasn't silently preparing to catch what others dropped. I was responding, not reacting. There were moments when I could have sped things up by stepping in early. I didn't. Not to make a point, but to let the system experience its own pacing. That's what moving in silence really is. Not secrecy. Restraint. I also noticed how rarely anyone asked me how I was managing the increased clarity. They noticed outcomes, not cost, efficiency, not effort. That told me the system still hadn't fully recalibrated. And that was okay. I wasn't trying to teach a lesson. I was protecting myself. The most important thing I did during this phase was nothing at all, when nothing was required of me. I didn't volunteer. I didn't anticipate. I didn't absorb. I waited. And in that waiting, my position solidified. Because silence, paired with preparation, doesn't create chaos. It creates contrast. And contrast is what makes value visible, without a single word needing to be raised. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They surfaced gradually, like pressure building in a system that had lost a stabilizing valve. Nothing dramatic at first, just subtle strain. Time slipped by days instead of hours. Questions that used to be resolved in a single message now took full threads. Meetings ran longer. Decisions were revisited more often, not because people disagreed, but because they weren't sure. The organization was still functioning, but it was no longer gliding. At first, the discomfort was misattributed. People blamed the workload, external factors, market pressure. The usual explanations require no self-examination. I watched quietly, not with satisfaction, but with attentiveness. What struck me most was how often people reached around the problem instead of naming it. They worked harder, added meetings, escalated prematurely. All the things systems do when they sense friction but don't understand its source. I received messages that revealed more than they intended. Do you know why this is taking longer than expected? Have you seen anything like this before? Something feels off with this process. I answered honestly, but narrowly. I didn't offer the full synthesis unless it was requested. I didn't rush to connect dots for people who hadn't yet realized there were dots to connect. This wasn't punishment. It was feedback. And slowly people began to feel the absence. Not of me, but of what I used to provide invisibly. There was a meeting where someone said, half joking, "We used to be better at this." The room went quiet, because everyone felt it, even if no one could explain it. I noticed frustration emerging, not directed at me, but at the work itself. How much effort is now required, at how little margin there was for assumption. That's when I understood something important. The system had been relying on unpaid cognitive labor, not unpaid in salary, but unpaid in recognition, in authority, in protection. And now that labor had boundaries. No one accused me of anything. No one could. I was still doing my job, still delivering, still responsive, but I wasn't compensating anymore. The consequences weren't personal. They were structural. Managers started asking for more detailed updates, not because they mistrusted me, but because they were feeling exposed. Without the quiet, smoothing layer, their decisions were more visible. Some began looping me in earlier again. Not automatically, but deliberately. Others doubled down on control, added oversight, requested more documentation, trying to regain a sense of certainty. Both responses were telling. The system was reacting, and reactions, unlike habits, can be observed. I didn't interfere with that process, because once consequences begin, interruption only delays understanding. There was no moment where anyone said, "We need Luna back the way she was." But there were moments where I saw recognition flicker, in the pause before someone spoke, in the recalibration of tone, in the subtle shift from assumption to inquiry. Still, no one named it outright. That's the nature of quiet loss. You feel it before you admit it. And the longer it goes unacknowledged, the harder it is to reverse without accountability. I didn't feel powerful during this phase. I felt clear. Clear about what had been taken for granted. Clear about what I had been protecting others from experiencing. Clear about the fact that the system was now encountering itself, without my constant mediation. The consequences were no longer theoretical. They lived. And once that happens, there are only two possible outcomes: adaptation or panic. By the time people realized something was wrong, they were already looking in the wrong direction. That's how it usually happens. The system didn't wake up one morning and say, "We lost something important." It said, "Why is everything harder than it used to be?" Panic doesn't arrive as chaos. It arrives as urgency layered on top of confusion. Suddenly, there were more check-ins, more alignment meetings, more just to be safe emails. Leadership wanted visibility into timelines, into risk, into accountability. Not because they distrusted anyone, but because they could feel control slipping through their fingers. What they didn't realize was that control had never been where they thought it was. I started receiving invitations framed as collaboration that were, underneath, attempts to restore a familiar equilibrium. Can you help us think through this? Can you sanity check the process? Can you just take a quick look? The word just returned, only now it carried a note of urgency. I helped when it aligned with what I had already defined. I answered questions, but I didn't step back into the role of invisible buffer. I stayed within scope. I kept ownership clean. That's when frustration surfaced. Not loud, not accusatory, just strained. People weren't upset with me. They were unsettled by the fact that the old shortcuts no longer worked, that the quiet fixes they had come to rely on weren't happening automatically. In one meeting, a manager said, "We need to move faster. We can't keep getting stuck on details." And for the first time, I didn't translate that into action. I let it sit, because those details were the very things I had been absorbing for years, at personal cost. Another moment came when leadership proposed a process change that mirrored something I had informally maintained all along. They presented it as a new initiative, a solution to recent inefficiencies. I listened, asked clarifying questions, pointed out implementation risks calmly, neutrally. They were surprised, not by the content, but by the fact that these insights weren't new. They had always been there, just quietly handled. That's when regret crept in. Not emotional regret, but organizational regret. The kind that shows up as hindsight. We should have formalized this earlier. We didn't realize how much depended on that. Those statements came too late, because the moment for easy correction had passed. What they were experiencing now wasn't a gap in process. It was a gap in trust, in awareness, in understanding how much had been outsourced to one person's discretion. And you can't fix that retroactively. You can't ask someone to go back to being undefined once they've chosen clarity. The confusion intensified because there was no single fix, no policy update, no role adjustment that could instantly restore what had been lost. The system had changed shape, and so had I. There was a meeting, one of the last before everything settled, where someone finally said it out loud. We didn't realize how much you were holding together. The room went quiet, not because it was dramatic, but because it was true. I didn't respond emotionally. I didn't correct them. I didn't accept or reject the statement. I simply acknowledged it, because by then, acknowledgement wasn't enough. What had been taken for granted for years couldn't be reinstalled as an expectation. The cost was now visible. The work was now distributed. The illusion of ease was gone. And the system was left with a choice it hadn't prepared for. Do the work differently, or keep struggling with the absence of a role that it never formally protected. Either way, there was no going back. The moment had passed. Not with anger, not with blame, but with irreversible clarity. The confrontation, when it finally came, didn't feel like a confrontation at all. There were no raised voices, no accusations, no list of grievances pulled from memory and sharpened by resentment. It was scheduled as a conversation, 30 minutes, quiet, deliberate. I walked into it without armor, because I didn't need any. 2 people were there, both seniors, both professional. They didn't look defensive. They looked tired. Not personally tired, but system tired. The kind of fatigue that comes from realizing something important has been misunderstood for a long time. They started by acknowledging the strain, how things had slowed, how coordination had become harder, how responsibilities felt blurred. I listened. Then they said my name, not as a solution, as a recognition. They asked me how I saw my role. I answered simply. I described what I owned, what I advised on, where I had been absorbing work that didn't belong to me, and how that had masked larger issues. I didn't frame it as a sacrifice. I framed it as misalignment. There was no emotion in my voice, just accuracy. I didn't say, you overlooked me. I said, this is how the system has been functioning. I didn't say, I was taken for granted. I said, these dependencies were informal, and that created risk. I could see them recalibrating in real time. One of them asked carefully, why didn't you raise this earlier? It wasn't an accusation. It was a genuine question. I answered honestly, because things were working, I said, and I thought it was my responsibility to keep them that way. Silence followed. Not awkward, just reflective. That sentence landed. We talked about the past without litigating it, about the present without defensiveness, about the future without promises that couldn't be kept. They asked what I needed. I didn't ask for validation, or apologies, or recognition. I asked for clarity, defined scope, explicit authority where responsibility existed, a structure that didn't rely on personal discretion to remain functional. Nothing more, nothing less. There was a pause, not because they disagreed, but because they were measuring what it would require to meet that ask. And in that pause, I knew something important. Whatever happened next, I would be fine. Because I wasn't negotiating from fear. I wasn't trying to recover something lost. I was protecting something present. The conversation ended without resolution, but with understanding. That was enough. I walked out feeling light, not because everything was fixed, but because everything had been said without heat. No bridges burned, no ground surrendered, just truth, placed carefully on the table. And sometimes that's the most powerful form of confrontation there is. Who I am now isn't defined by what I endured. It's defined by what I no longer tolerate, quietly, calmly, without resentment. After that conversation, things didn't resolve overnight. Some structures shifted, others resisted, a few compromises were made, a few weren't. But something fundamental had already changed, regardless of outcome. I was no longer operating from the need to be needed. That alone redefined everything. I still do good work. That never stopped being important to me. I still care about outcomes, about clarity, about building things that last. but I no longer confuse care with self-erasure. Where I once filled silence automatically, I now assess it. Where I once anticipated, I now confirm. Where I once absorbed, I now define. Not aggressively, not defensively, deliberately. I've learned that professionalism doesn't require self-sacrifice, and that calm doesn't mean compliant. That being steady doesn't mean being static. Most importantly, I've learned that visibility isn't about speaking louder. It's about standing where decisions actually form. I don't explain myself as much anymore, not because I'm closed, but because clarity speaks for itself when it's consistently embodied. I don't rush to justify boundaries. I let them exist long enough to be understood. Some people adjusted, others didn't. That's okay. Systems, like people, reveal their values when pressure is applied, not through conflict, but through choice. I stopped trying to be universally acceptable and started being internally coherent. That coherence changed how I show up everywhere, not just at work. I listen differently now. I respond with intention instead of reflex. I notice when I'm about to rescue something that isn't mine, and I stop. There's no bitterness in this, no sense of having been wronged. Just accuracy. Accuracy about what I bring. Accuracy about what it costs. Accuracy about what deserves my energy. I'm still quiet, but I'm no longer invisible. Quiet now is a position, not a byproduct. And when I speak, it's not to prove relevance. It's because relevance already exists. If there's one thing I know for certain now, it's this. The moment you stop organizing your life around being indispensable, you become free. Free to choose alignment over approval. Free to let systems adjust. Or not. Free to move without apology. That's who I am now. Not louder, not harder, just present. There's a quiet myth we're taught early on that if we're patient, reliable, and fair, the world will eventually meet us at that same level. Sometimes it does. And sometimes it simply adjusts around us. What I learned through all of this isn't that people are cruel or that systems are evil. It's something far more uncomfortable and far more useful. Most systems don't exploit you intentionally. They exploit what you allow, especially when you allow it calmly. For a long time, I believed that being the person who fixed things made me valuable, and it did. But value without definition is fragile. It makes you essential without making you secure, trusted without being protected. When you rescue things quietly, you remove the evidence of strain. When you absorb impact silently, you teach others that impact doesn't exist. And when that happens, your effort doesn't become heroic. It becomes invisible. The turning point in my story wasn't anger. It wasn't courage in the dramatic sense. It was something smaller and more durable. It was the moment I realized I didn't need to prove my worth anymore. I needed to place it. Not everywhere, not all the time, but where it could actually be seen, respected, and sustained. This isn't a call to withdraw. It's not a call to confront. And it's definitely not a call to harden yourself. It's an invitation to ask a different question. Instead of, how do I make this work? Ask, why am I the one making this work? Instead of, can I handle this? Ask, should I be the one handling this at all? Because quiet competence, without boundaries, will always be consumed faster than it's acknowledged. And silence, when it's unconscious, becomes a trap. But silence, chosen, placed, intentional, becomes power. Not power over others, power over yourself. If you're listening to this and recognizing pieces of your own life in it, I want you to know this. You don't have to become louder to matter. You don't have to become colder to be respected, and you don't have to burn anything down to step out of invisibility. Sometimes the most radical thing you can do is stop rescuing what refuses to recognize you. Let the system feel its own weight. Let clarity replace exhaustion. And let your presence be something that's chosen by you first. So I'll leave you with this one question, and I'd really like to hear your answer in the comments. What changed in your life when you stopped fixing things that were never meant to be carried by you alone?